What happened next changed Daniel Ellsberg in ways that would make him the person who would leak the Pentagon Papers. In 1965, Ellsberg was invited to go to Vietnam as part of a State Department study. Just going to Vietnam sets him apart from a lot of Pentagon colleagues. But this wasn't some junket. This was Ellsberg, the former Marine. He stayed in Vietnam for 2 years. And he did some pretty crazy stuff. He drove around on back roads no one thought were safe. He went out on patrol with combat units. He got shelled, got caught in an ambush. And he learned that much of what war commanders were telling Washington was a lie. The Pentagon was getting inflated body counts of how many soldiers we killed. And there were glowing reports, complete with tables and charts, reporting statistics on patrols that never happened. Ellsberg also talked with the Vietnamese people, saw their fear and rage. Thousands of civilians were dying, hundreds of thousands. American and South Vietnamese soldiers were burning villages, bombing towns, spraying Agent Orange, and stripping the jungle to dust and sticks. Ellsberg tasted the war, and he came home convinced we were never going to win.
The people we were fighting were not going to give up. We weren't going to beat them. They were very good soldiers, and they were fighting in their backyard.
When Ellsberg got back to the United States, it was 1967.
The stated purpose of the demonstration was to again stop the draft. Back and down.
And the news media was full of protesters marching in the streets. Ellsberg didn't know it at the time, but even Secretary of Defense McNamara had concluded Vietnam was a lost cause. McNamara had ordered a secret study about decision-making in Vietnam. It was so secret, even President Johnson didn't know it was happening. This study, which covered the entire history of the conflict, going back to World War II, would later be called the Pentagon Papers. They were looking for researchers who had expertise in Vietnam, so they asked Ellsberg to help write it. He didn't have to plan the war anymore. Now he could write about why it all went wrong.
I was still thinking of this as something that we'd had a right to do and might be doing again somewhere. And obviously we had not been successful. So the question was, what could we learn from our past experience?
While he worked on the study, Ellsberg was still seeing top-secret communications about the war. And one day in 1968, he saw a memo from Commanding General William Westmoreland that raised his deepest fears.
I knew there was a possibility of their using nuclear weapons that was being discussed in the White House. And I also knew that Westmoreland was asking for a couple 100,000 more men, basically to invade North Vietnam, which would bring the Chinese in, which would mean nuclear war.
Ellsberg showed the top-secret memo to Senator Bobby Kennedy, who was running for president. He didn't think he was out of bounds here. After all, Kennedy had been Attorney General for his brother JFK, so clearly he had security clearances. A few days later, a story about the troop request showed up in the New York Times. Someone had leaked it. Ellsberg says it wasn't him, and he doesn't know who it was. But the story blew up, and Democrats in Congress started openly turning against Johnson's war escalation. This got Ellsberg thinking about the power of leaks. Could leaks slow down the war?
My idea was one a day, so that the president would know that somebody with very high access, which I had at that time, was leaking.
He thought that if Johnson did decide to escalate the war again, he probably wouldn't tell the American people how many troops he really wanted.
That's what he had done for 3 years at this point. Lied every time about what he was actually sending. This time he would know that somebody who knew what he was doing was going to leak it. And he couldn't do it secretly. That was my idea.
Ellsberg had spent years in the inner circle of government secrets. But now, the patriotic Cold Warrior went rogue.
So, for the first time now, I break my promise, not my oath of office, but my contractual promises not to reveal secrets.
That's important to understand. Secrecy was an article of faith to Ellsberg and everyone he worked with. But he decided now that secrecy wasn't his highest duty.
Every member of Congress, every member of the armed services, every officer in the armed services, and every official in the executive branch takes the same oath And it's not an oath to the president. And it's not even an oath to secrecy. It's an oath to defend and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
So in 1968, a full 3 years before the Pentagon Papers, Ellsberg staged his first real leak. He gave New York Times journalist Neil Sheehan a report claiming that the U.S. had Viet Cong and other communist troops on the run across the country. General Westmoreland had written this report for the White House at the end of the year. Problem is, it was totally wrong. Just a couple of weeks later, the communists suddenly attacked military command posts all over South Vietnam in the Tet Offensive. Not bad for a force that was supposedly all but defeated.
So I leaked Westmoreland's year-end report, top secret, eyes only, for the president, saying that we have emptied South Vietnam, of the Viet Cong.
Westmoreland was removed from command the next day. Leaking, it turned out, could work. Though Ellsberg was still running in elite national security circles, he started meeting anti-war activists and even hanging out at peace rallies. He was leading a double life, peace activist and top-secret military researcher.
You've asked, what did my understanding?
To Ellsberg, that meant the war was illegitimate from the beginning. He believed Americans should never have been there. And that meant all the people killed on both sides were not casualties of war.
The unjustified homicide seemed to me murder, and a process of murder that was still going on. I wasn't interested just in setting the record straight or putting out history or something. I was interested in educating people to the need to stop this war.
Around the same time, Ellsberg learned something else that pushed him into action. The new president, Richard Nixon, wasn't actually going to de-escalate the war. Nixon wanted leverage for peace talks, and he decided a secret expansion of U.S. bombing would be the way to get it. Ellsberg didn't know it at the time, but Nixon was even considering a nuclear attack in Vietnam. Nixon talked about it with his advisor, Henry Kissinger, in a real Dr. Strangelove moment that actually happened. This recording is from 1972, after the Pentagon Papers were leaked, but it gives you a sense of where Nixon's head was at. The tape is super scratchy, but Ellsberg knows it by heart.
Well, no, I'd rather use a nuclear bomb.
Henry, I'd use the nuclear bomb. Got that, Henry? Kissinger would say, well, Mr. President, I think that would be just too much. Too much, Henry? That's too big. I just want you to think big, for Christ's sake.
I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
It occurred to Ellsberg that the files in his top-secret safe at work, the Pentagon Papers, might be a weapon to use against the war, if he could get them to the public.
I felt I have here thousands of pages of documentation of murder. Maybe I can convince people that it's still going on. So I asked my friend Tony Rousseau if he knew where there was a Xerox machine.
Keep in mind, in 1970, a Xerox machine was high-end technology. It wasn't like everyone just had one. But it turned out Tony's girlfriend did have one at her advertising agency.
So we started that night I took the papers out from my safe and began copying them. And I did that for most of the next year.
He didn't just copy the papers once. He made a bunch of copies and handed them out to friends to hang on to in case he was ever arrested. He was also showing bits of the papers to historians, think tanks, and pretty soon, reporters.